Welcome to the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit. These weekly podcasts feature expository messages delivered to edify the soul. Now let's join Pastor Dave as he presents this week's message. All right, if you have your Bible, won't you turn with me to Acts chapter 14. All right, you're there in Acts chapter 14. We're going to begin our reading today in verse 11. So let me just set this up. Last week we looked at verse 7, 8, 9, 10, which was the story about the lame man at Lystra who heard the gospel, preached, and as well as I said today in the catechism, he attended with diligence the hearing of the word, and the Spirit of God used the word of God and built faith in his heart, and he reached out and believed, and all that happened to him, the lameness going away and the leaping and all that happened because of what Jesus did in his heart. Well, today we're going to see the other side of this story, which is the other people that are there. Like I said, we know that one man heard, but there were a lot of people that didn't hear. And as the catechism said this morning, it is made effectual. The preaching of the word is made effectual. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes people hear, but there's no effectual hearing when they do. So we're going to see that this morning. Verse 11, beginning there, Acts chapter 14, and we'll read down, I think we're going to read down to verse 19. Verse 19. And when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, "The gods are come down to us in the likeness of men." And they called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. When the priests of Jupiter, which was before the city, brought oxen and garlands unto the gates, and would have done sacrifice with the people, which, when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of, they rent their clothes and ran in among the people, crying out, saying, "Sirs, why do ye these things? Let me go back. Verse 15. And saying, Sirs, why do ye these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that ye should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth, the sea, and all things that are therein, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings scarce restrained they the people, that they had not done sacrifice unto them. And there came certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium, who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. So I've entitled this message, "The Need for the Gospel." The need for the gospel. Do we really believe that people need the gospel? Do we really believe that? Are people in their heart of hearts basically good? I mean, that's really the question that I want to ask. Let me tell you the story about a little boy, and I'll call him Little Willie. Little Willie is a little boy, 8, 9 years old, something like that, 10, something right in there. And he was at home one day, and his mother called him, "Little Willie!" And Little Willie came running. And she said, "Little Willie," she said, "I'm going to give you $1, and I want you to go down to the convenience store and buy me a loaf of bread." Now, this is back when you could buy a loaf of bread for $1. She said, "And when you buy that loaf of bread," she said, "you can keep whatever change is left. Just put it in your pocket, and that'll be your payment for going to get the bread for me." Now, when I tell you the story about Little Willie, I'm thinking in my mind of the place where I grew up. And I grew up in South Louisville, and 2 blocks from my house, there was a convenience store. You know, today we have like Ameristops and Speedways and all these places. This was just a little bitty store. I think maybe at one time it may have had a gas pump in the parking lot, but when I was a boy, it was just a parking lot. And and it was a mom and pop shop. And I loved to go in that store because in that store there was candy. And in that store there were toys that I could afford. Like, those little balsam wood airplanes that you could stitch together. And if you were lucky, they might have one of those that had the propeller on it with the rubber band. And you could put that thing together, put that rubber band on that propeller and fly it. I love those. But the thing that little store that I'm thinking about had, the one in my neighborhood when I was a boy, they had ices. And you could go in, you could buy yourself a Coke Icy out of that store. And on a hot summer day, you ride your bike down to that store and get yourself a cold Icy. There was nothing better than that. And that store happened to be at the bottom of a hill. So when you rode your bike down to that store, if you get your speed up enough before you hit the incline, and the incline curved around to the left. So the further down you went, the steeper it got before you leveled out and you got down to the store. Man, you going at a clip down that hill. So little Willie gets on his bike, and he rides down to the convenience store with that hot dollar bill stuck in his pocket. And he gets down to the convenience store, and he walks in there, and there's Mr. Hanson, who's always behind the counter. And he says, "Hi, Mr. Hanson." And Mr. Hanson says, "Hi, Willie." And Willie walks down the aisle. He doesn't really know where the bread is, so he's kind of looking around till he finds the spot where the bread, because he never goes down that way. So he finds the loaf of bread, and he thinks, well, while I'm here, I don't know how much money I'm going to get out of this dollar. I'm going to start looking and see what I might want to buy. So he happens to go down the candy aisle, and as he's walking down the candy aisle, in walks Mrs. Johnson. And Mrs. Johnson happens to talk to Mr. Hanson, and they're standing there having a conversation, and it's a couple aisles back from the counter, so Willie just happens to pick up a piece of candy and slip it into his pocket. And he continues down the aisle. He goes around to the toy side of the aisle, and he looks at all the airplanes and all the little gadgets and all the little plastic toys that are in there that cost less than $1. And he's looking and he's looking. And when he gets done, he hears Mrs. Johnson leave, and he walks up to the counter, lays the bread up on the counter, and Mr. Hanson rings him out. Willie gives him the $1. Mr. Hanson gives him change back, puts it in a bag, and as Willie turns around, he's putting the change in his pocket. In walk 3 or 4 boys. One of these boys happens to be little Willie's rival. And little Willie doesn't like this boy at all. And he's kind of a bully, and that's why he always travels with this gang of boys. And they always are on their bikes, and Willie doesn't like them. So he goes out one door while they're coming in the other door, and they happen to say something snide and off-color to Willie as he's going out, and he walks over to his bike, which happens to be down there by their pile of bikes, and they're inside, and Willie walks over to the boy's bike that he doesn't like, and he lets the air out of the back tire. Climbs on his bike, slings the bag of bread onto the handlebars of his bike, and rides home. And as soon as he gets home, his mother says, "Oh, little Willie, you're such an obedient child, such a good little boy." She didn't see the candy in his pocket. And she didn't know what he did to his little buddy, his bike. Was Willie a good little boy? No, Willie's not a good little boy. Willie's just a little boy. And often we think that the moral actions that we see in others, their controlled behavior, their good deeds, their organized, disciplined life, their willing smile, their well-met attitude, their soft answer to angry words, their religious obedience, their well-heeled lifestyle, their charitable offerings, their obedience to mom and to dad, to community laws, their reverence for patriotic themes, a mind that cherishes family and community values and histories, or a willingness to sacrifice for others indicates goodness of heart. There's no need for them to hear the gospel, right? They've met the requirements for salvation because they're simply good people. You see, because that's all we can see. We can't look inside the heart. Thank God for that. As Adam Clark said, it's good that we can't look into the heart. If we did, we would despair. We look on the outside and we see all the goodness that they do. We don't see the candy in their pocket that they stole, or the hateful deed that they did in the shadow. We don't see that. We see little Willie, the good little boy who does what his mama asked him to do. And so we have today presented to us a group of people that we don't even know. They are, I call them the mob. We'll call them the mob for purposes of the sermon today, because just a group. We don't know who they are. They're just the Lystrans. They're the people that live there in the city of Lystra. Now, just as a reminder, the lame man who listened to Paul, he heard him speak. We know that one man heard the gospel message. But what we see in the people, because there are other people there, is quite different than what happened to the lame man. Notice verse 11. When the people saw what Paul had done. You see, they weren't listening. I mentioned this last week. They weren't listening. They were watching. Men are always looking. Men are always longing for a miracle. They always want the flashy thing. They always want the shiny thing. You know, they always want the new and popular and the chic and the now and all the rest. They want it to look a certain way and sound a certain way. They want the exciting thing. And so they're looking for the exciting, and they see this miracle, and what's more exciting than that? This man who's been lame since his mother's womb, now he's leaping and jumping and walking around. These people are excited. They see something wonderful, outstanding, supernatural even. Oh my goodness. But I think we should remember that it's not always the outward that the Lord is looking for. He's looking at the heart. Remember our lesson in 1 Samuel. It's not the outside the Lord looks on, it's the heart that he looks on. And Jesus even affirms this in John chapter 2. In John chapter 2, early in John's gospel, we have Jesus going up to the Passover on the feast day in verse 23 in chapter 2. And it says there that many believed in his name when they saw the miracles which he did. So they're believing because they're seeing. They're not listening, they're seeing. But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. Jesus knew, and still he came. So the people saw what Paul had done. Now notice that second piece there in verse 11. What Paul had done. Is that right? Is that true? Is what happened to the lame man what Paul did? What part did he have in the wonderful work? He really didn't. I mean, he preached the gospel and he prodded the man. He was the catalyst for the man's faith when he said, "Get up, walk on your feet." The man already had everything he needed. He had the faith. He was exultant in the Lord Jesus. And so when Paul said, "Get up," he said, "Well, yeah, he can do that too." What had Paul really done? See, they thought Paul, by some sort of hocus-pocus power, had worked a miracle on this man. Paul was just the instrument. He wasn't the doer of it. So they get it all wrong. The people saw, they didn't hear. The people said Paul had done something. They didn't attribute it to the Lord. You see, if they had been listening, they would have glorified the Lord Jesus. But they weren't listening, they were watching. And they realized that it was Paul. This is how we create celebrity in our culture today. We think they do something wonderful, they say something wonderful, and they don't. It's the Lord that's doing the work, or sometimes doing the work. Sometimes it's nothing more than human charisma when we create celebrity. But these people, they've got it all backwards. They saw and they assigned the thing to Paul. And then notice there in verse 11, it says, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. Their emotions were stirred. They were touched so deeply that they spoke not in Latin nor in Greek, but in their heart language. When it's something on the inside, when it's something that touches you deeply, you go right back home, don't you? You go right back home. You're going to say it in your heart language because that's the one that speaks your heart most clearly. They lifted up their voices in the speech of Lycaonia. I doubt very seriously, I doubt today that there is a Lycaonian language like what they spoke. This is probably an ancient dialect found only in that area in Turkey. However many years ago that was that they said this. But this was their heart language. And they lift up their voice and they say this. Many things can create an emotional response in us. Do not mistake the emotional response for a moving of the Spirit of God. We do that so often. And I bet they had goosebumps as big as a plum on their arms. They probably were doing this. Look at my goosebumps. Look at what happened. Oh, look at this. How wonderful. Oh, they were exultant in Paul, and they were exultant in what they saw, and oh, it's moved them so deeply. But instead of crying for Christ Jesus to save them, they said, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. They still go in the wrong direction. They go directly to what they know. They're good Lycaonians. They're good Lystrans. They're speaking in the language of Lycaonia. They're good because they knew about Jupiter. They knew about his ilk, all the pantheon of the Greeks and the Romans. They knew all of that. They had adopted them. So they applied their teaching to the current situation, which meant that this was divine. And if this was divine, then something is going on here, something different. Their version of divine now is revealed. They are still believing in Jupiter and Mercury and all the gods in that pantheon. So they're behaving as good Lystrans would. Verse 12, they called Barnabas Jupiter, Paul Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. Jupiter is the Latin form of the Greek word Zeus. We know that the Romans adopted the Greek pantheon of gods. And Zeus, of course, is the head of that pantheon. Jupiter is the name for the head of the pantheon that was worshipped by the Romans. And so Barnabas was the big guy. He was the chief man. The Roman understanding of this god Zeus or Jupiter was that he was responsible for all of the heavenly bodies, the moon, the sun, the stars. He controlled the weather. He sent rain. He gave produce to men. He gave victory in battle. Barnabas was an older man. Barnabas probably was a little more stately than Paul. He wasn't the speaker, so perhaps they thought because of that he was actually Jupiter and Paul's doing his bidding. And so they assigned him to the god Jupiter. And they said, the gods have come down to us in the form of men. And they just decided right there that Barnabas was Jupiter. Paul they called Mercurius because he was the chief speaker. Mercury, which is the head of which is the herald of the gods. He is the guide of the dead into Hades. He's the inventor of the lyre. He's the patron of trade, games, oratory, and he's also the god of wine. He brings wine to people. So they assign Paul and Barnabas these roles, and then here comes the priest of Jupiter. Notice verse 13. The priest of Jupiter, which was before the city, he came, so the little temple was out there. Often in the ancient world, a city would be built, or a city would have a temple built or an altar outside the gates, and that's where they did their worship. Sometimes it would be outside the gates. Sometimes it would be above the gates, over the gates of the city. Sacrifices would be made there in worship, in celebration, at different times of the year, depending on who the god was at that little city worship. And apparently, here at Lystra, it was Jupiter. And they had a temple just outside the gates. It was probably a small, mean affair, but was there nonetheless. And notice that the priest of Jupiter brings oxen and garlands unto the gates. So this was not just any sacrifice, but this was the sacred ox that was kept at the temple. It was probably adorned with garlands. You know how they do the Kentucky Derby winner? They lay that blanket of roses over the top of the horse's shoulders on the front. Yeah, well, that's exactly what they did to this oxen. They've got this garland of flowers that covers the oxen, and they bring him. This identifies this oxen as the oxen that's sanctified and is meant only for the gods. So they're coming in full worship mode. I mean, they've got the ox, the garland, the priest. The people are probably dancing, going outside the gate. They're so happy, so excited. When God shows up at the gates of your city, you don't pass up the opportunity to do him service. And they had two of them there, Jupiter and Mercury. And notice it says, and would have done sacrifice with the people, that is the priest. These people are immediately willing to shed the blood of the sacred ox in order to honor what they thought were gods. They were apparently religious people. Do they need the gospel? They lived according to a religious creed. Do they need the gospel? You know, when we think about the gospel and we think about places like the deepest jungle with headhunters and cannibals and things and the chaos of that kind of animistic worship, we're on the ball with the gospel needs to go out to those people. But when it's a religious, ordered, disciplined, thing, sometimes we do they really, really need it? Look how beautifully the oxen was decorated. Notice the order of the priest who came to the gate. What wonderful enthusiasm they held in their hearts. What deep emotion, what intense resolve. Aren't they good? Do they really need to hear the preaching of the gospel? When you're in a secular place, and this I'm reading a quote now from the North American Mission Board calendar. I just read this on Wednesday night, and I was preparing the message, and I thought, that'll fit right in here. And I love this. It is so true. Quote, when you are in a secular place, it's easy to see the need for the gospel. But when religion is all around, lostness is well camouflaged. End quote. So true. So true. And these people, boy, talk about religion, it's everywhere. Everywhere. What happens? Well, verse 14, the apostles come in and they rebuke the madness of the people. When the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they rent their clothes and ran in among the people, crying out and saying, Sirs, why do ye these things? Now, the tearing of the outer garment was to symbolize the contrition, the grief, the sadness, the shock of what they're doing. And everybody knew what that meant. So they tore their clothes and they run in and they say, whoa, stop. What in the world are you doing? The speech which stopped an offering happens right here. And I want to go through this with you just line by line because this is so powerful. They begin with this question, Sirs, why do you these things? Now, this is a rhetorical question. It's obvious why they're doing it. Everybody would have said, well, you know why we're doing it. You're Jupiter and you're Mercury. You're the gods that have come down to us. We just saw a miracle happen, and the only way that could happen is if the gods were here. And so that's why we're doing it. Everyone knows the answer to this question. Sirs, why do you do these things? It's obvious. But the question along with the torn clothes would have made the people stop and listen. They would have stopped and they would have said, well, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. The gods would never tear their clothes. Notice also the politeness of the apostles here. They said, Sirs. They didn't berate the people. They approached them gently. The only thing that is extreme here is the tearing of the clothes. But notice how they address them. Sirs, why do you do these things? They treat them as important men, which they were, of course, there in the city of Lystra. Then they give them this statement of fact. Look at the next phrase there in verse 14. Verse 15. We also are men of like passions with you. The gods are not present. What we have here are men. So men are saying we're not gods, we're men. We experience the same things that you experience, the same feelings, the same everything. Gods are not here. And this is a nice way of saying to these people, you misunderstand. We're men of like passions with you. They're saying to them, you don't understand things. Let us tell you why you don't understand them. It also leads to the thought that there is something more at work here than what their superstitions believe. You see, their superstition says, well, it must be Jupiter and Mercury. Paul and Barnabas say, wait a minute, we're men of like passions with you. You see, and so these people have to sit back and say, well, if that's true, if that's the truth, and the truth is not Jupiter and Mercury, but we have men here, then what in the world's going on? See how gently they take it out of the superstition. Let's talk about this. Let's think about this for a moment. We're not the gods. And if we're not the gods, then reconsider what you're about to do and what you just saw. Notice the correction that he gives them there. The next phrase there in 15. And preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God. The false gods have always been called vanities. They are empty and void of life. That's why they're a vanity. It's made up. It's a dream. It's a fantasy. It's a horror show. Whatever you want to say about whatever God it happens to be. It's all that. It's just emptiness, void of any true life. However, the apostles point them to the one who is life when they say to them, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein. We preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God. There is one that's alive. It doesn't happen to be Jupiter or Mercury or Helen or any of the rest of them, however many there are. Those are not gods. Those are empty and void of meaning. And notice, he gives them the question there, why do you do these things? A statement of fact, we're men of like passion, which makes them now question their decision. And then correction, he says, we're preaching unto you about the living God, not the vanities that you now hold. So can you imagine, the people are kind of a little bit back on their heels now. So everything that they have just done has been stripped away by the words of the apostles. Now, they're going to talk about this living God. Notice there in, what verse are we in now? 15 still. Which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein. This comes from the Psalms. It's Psalm 146, verses 5 and 6. There David writes, happy is he that hath the God of Jacob for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is therein, which keepeth truth forever. So when they say this, they're quoting from the Psalms, but it's more than that. This phrase from the Psalms also finds its way into an early prayer of the church, there in Acts chapter 2. And when they heard that is the saying of the council, they lifted up their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, thou art God, which has made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. So this psalm had worked its way into the church as a part of their belief system now. They're praying this prayer. Paul and Barnabas are speaking this prayer. It's probably a part, actually, of their worship every Sunday. They probably say this psalm as a prayer that they pray every week. The early church is speaking this. And I want you to notice something here. Isn't it fascinating here how creationist the apostles are? They believe in a created order, that God had created heaven, earth, and everything that is in it. And they say that to these people. It wasn't Jupiter that did that. It wasn't Mercury that did that. Let us tell you who did that, the living God. And he's the one that made the earth, the sea, the heavens, everything that's in them. He's the one that did it. And so they begin with this theme of creation. Why do they do that? Because these people have no other foundation. So they go all the way back to the very beginning. Let us tell you about the God and what he's done. Who, in times past, suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. You see, sacrificing to a vanity, having a doctrine, a creed, a catechism based on a vanity, is walking in their own ways. The apostles are still gently leading them back from the edge of the cliff. God has suffered this to happen. So don't be condemned, but we're not going to tell you the truth. Here's the truth. There is a living God. It's not Jupiter and it's not Mercury, but there is a living God. He has suffered this to happen, but now we come to tell you something new, something different, something wonderful. Notice how they continue there in verse 17. Nevertheless, he left not himself without a witness in that he did good. Jesus teaches us about the goodness of the living God and that he treats all his creatures the same. There in Matthew chapter 5, verse 45. Jesus said that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven, for he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. God has not left himself without a witness. Do you see the rain? Do you see the fruitful fields? Do you see the harvest? God has done this. He's done this for you. He's done all of this for you. He did good. That's what he says. This is his witness. He's done good to you. Even though you're not worshiping him, the living God is still giving you rain and seasons and harvest and food and everything to make glad your hearts. Now, Paul or Barnabas, whoever it is that's speaking here, goes right at the gods, especially Jupiter and Mercury. Notice, he gave us rain from heaven. Jupiter doesn't send the rain. Now, Paul doesn't say this. Remember, again, he's gently leading them. He says he gave us rain from heaven. He doesn't say Jupiter doesn't give us rain. No, he says God left himself, not without a witness, in that he does good, giving us rain. It's not Jupiter. Fruitful seasons. This is not because Jupiter has provided. Filling our hearts with food and gladness. This does not come from Mercury, who gives you the harp and who gives you the wine. Your hearts filled with gladness comes from only one, and that is the Lord God, the living God, who made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them is. So the speech of theirs is beautiful, and it comes right to their need, right down where they live, because they're believing in a God or several gods, and they believe these things about their gods. But Paul and Barnabas come and say, we're not those gods. We're just men. We're here to tell you about the living God, who you don't know it, but he's the one who's been caring for you all this time, even though you haven't been worshiping him. So this is gorgeous, the way this is done. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this just describes for us the mercy of God here. God's mercy to these people. They want to make the apostles into something they're not. They want to sacrifice, a blood sacrifice to them. The apostles say, oh, wait a minute. And they give them this message, and the mercy of God is just spread all over everything that they say, from the very first word, sirs, all the way down to the very end, filling our hearts with food and gladness. Notice how the apostles include themselves in that as well. All right, so the mob's reversal here, it comes at the end of the chapter, or the end of these verses, beginning in 18. And with these sayings, scarce restrained they the people. The people wanted to turn Barnabas and Paul into demigods. They wanted them to be the gods that they had always worshipped. And they wanted to sacrifice to them. Unrestrained by the gospel, they would have carried out their intent. But thank God the apostles were there, and that didn't happen. The restraint was gentle. It was loving. It was directly addressed to the problem and to the truth. Their address showed the foolishness of idolatry when there was a living God to be worshiped. Yeah, there's someone to be worshiped, but it's not these vanities. It's the living God. Now, you notice the difference between 18 and now 19. And there came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium who persuaded the people. Now, Paul and Barnabas had just restrained the people. Here come folks from Iconium, and they persuade the people. Does this have anything to do with the idolatry? I think so. Now enter the evil element into the test tube of Lystra, or not. Actually, no. These men who come from Iconium, they're just the catalyst, you see. You know, when Paul preached and the lame man heard, when Paul said, stand up on your feet, Paul was just the catalyst. He was the thing that caused it to happen. He prodded the man. He didn't cause it, but he prodded the man. Come on, stand up. You've got the faith. Just stand up. He saw it in him. These people who come from Iconium, they must have seen something in the Lystrans that caused them to prod them in a different direction. Paul was the catalyst for the lame man. These folk from Iconium, who we know they were jealous of Paul and Barnabas, they came, and now they come in here, and the potential is already there for this thing to happen, what we're going to read next. It's kind of like a glass of water. You know, a glass of water is just water. It's stable. All the elements in the water, the hydrogen and the oxygen, all of that is in the right combination. You know, it's not going to blow up on you. You pour it out of your tap, fill your glass of water up, take a sip. It's wonderful. It's refreshing. But you put into that glass of water a catalyst with an electric charge, and what happens? The water gets on fire, and you have oxygen separating from hydrogen. You got all this gas coming out, and as long as you leave that catalyst in there, you're going to have that reaction. Here we have these people. They've heard Paul and Barnabas speak, and they don't know what next to do. And here comes the catalyst, but it's not catalyst for a good. It's catalyst for an evil. They incite these men. But, ladies and gentlemen, the potential is already there. Because these people in the mob, they're not believers. Will basically good people do evil things when persuaded to do so? Or will that basic goodness hold off the temptation to exercise their power? Well, it didn't keep them from wanting to sacrifice according to their idols' demands. But maybe, just maybe, it will here. Let's see what happens. And having stoned Paul, no, I guess not, drew him out of the city, supposing that he had been dead. They go from praising Paul as Mercury to stoning Paul for what? For what? We don't know how these folks from Iconium persuaded them, but notice the quick change, the turnaround here. From, oh, these are the gods, to, let's kill him. What in the world happened? What was it that they said that stirred the passions? Passions that just a little bit ago were all excited and jubilant and joyful about the gods being among them. But now suddenly, passion's hot enough to kill over. To kill a man. To kill a man. It's already in their heart. The corruption is already there. It just needed a little prodding, a little catalyst. These men from Iconium, they come and they make them do this. Didn't take a whole lot of persuading, apparently. Maybe the people were sad that Paul and Barnabas said no. Nobody gets to say no today. Do you know that? Nobody says no today. My truth is my truth unless it's a Bible truth, and then the culture has to kill it today. That's today. I think it was the same in Lycaonia and in Lystra. In Paul's day, it's the very same thing today. You don't get to say no. I cannot stand behind this pulpit and tell you that the Bible tells you that homosexuality is a sin and you shouldn't do it, because you'll say, well, that's my truth. I'm just going to live my truth. And you say to me, well, that's just not merciful. It's not kind. It's not loving. Ladies and gentlemen, it happens to be the Bible truth, whether you like it or not. But I can't say that today, and you didn't hear me say that today, did you? Of course not. I wouldn't say that from this pulpit. I can't say today that alcohol is a poor decision for a Christian, and the Bible tells you not to do it. Can't do that, because that's your truth, and if you want to do your truth, well, who am I to tell you no? Can't do that. Of course, I would never say those words. You see, in our hearts, there are so many things that we don't want anybody to tell us no, because it's my right to do whatever I want to do. But the Bible happens to say, don't worship the idol. The Bible happens to say a lot of things that we pleasantly ignore until we can't, and then we want to kill it, because we can't have God's truth messing up my good time. Can't have it. And nobody's going to say no to these people. And probably the folks from Iconium came over and they said, what do you mean he told you couldn't sacrifice? What kind of people are these? You need to get rid of him. Because if you don't get rid of him, he's just going to spread this stuff all around. So they said, okay, let's go kill him. Took up stones and stoned him. So we see the same group of people go from orderly, excited, religiously disciplined, organized group of Lystrans to a violent mob, easily persuaded that has no qualms about killing a man. Is the gospel needed? This is a picture of the emptiness of the human heart. Jeremiah said of the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? 17:9. David said the same thing in Psalm 14:3. All have gone aside; they are all together become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Do they need to hear the gospel? Or are men basically good at heart? What about the men of our generation? Same. Just the same. Yeah, we say, oh, we're so advanced, we're so technologically developed, we're first world, you know. First world. We'll be the first in hell. Because we still have the same need. Still, there is a need for the preaching of the gospel. If anything illustrates it, ladies and gentlemen, it is this thing that's happening in Lystra. So when we think about filling up our shoe boxes, and those little shoe boxes going into the world, all the world, think about the children that are going to hear the gospel for the first time. They need to hear the gospel. Oh, we're giving them toys and things like that, but the most important thing that's happening with that shoebox is not a Christmas gift. The most important thing that's happening in that shoebox is the Savior that came at Christmas. That's what's happening. That's why it's important. That's why it's important that we support missionaries like we do here in America, because, boy, America needs the gospel. And all around the world, because every man, woman, boy, and girl within the sound of a voice needs to hear the preaching of the gospel, that Jesus saves, that he was killed, buried, rose again the third day, and now, ladies and gentlemen, sits at the right hand of God, and he provides salvation for every man, woman, boy, or girl who will call on him. And only that can change the human heart. Only the preaching of the gospel.
Jesus will meet you.
Thanks for listening to this week's message. Please join us again next time for another installment of the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit.